not even be in this position, and yet
other countries do not do.
Mix your lives, you intermingle them.
They need stability.
Right? You see a t-shirt come
the day to defend his economic priorities, speaking in one of the parts of America whose factories, jobs, and daily commerce are most tightly bound to Canada. He was speaking only days after his administration announced a 50% tariff on billions of dollars worth of Canadian goods, a measure officials say is scheduled to take effect on August 19th.
Rocks in their harbour. And I want to be clear on the analogy. When you put rocks in your harbour, you make it harder for boats to go in and out. You make it harder for trade. So rocks in the harbour is if the U.S. puts...
What makes this round different is not only the rate, it is the reach. And that raises the question I want to work through carefully. How serious is this threat? And what happens to Canadians and to American border states if that date arrives with no agreement? Let me start with what is actually confirmed, because in a story like this, the difference between an announcement and an implemented policy matters enormously.
On the other hand, we're seeing more tariffs potentially added on August 19th. Just zoom out for me. What is your sense of optimism, sense of...
The United States administration has said it will apply a 50% tariff on a broad set of Canadian goods with an effective date of August 19th. That is the stated timetable. It has not yet taken effect. Between now and then, officials on both sides of the border have said talks are continuing, and the intensity of those discussions has increased. So what we have is a declared measure with a deadline attached, and a negotiation running against that clock. The reason this particular announcement has landed differently is technical, but its practical meaning is easy to understand. Since the early stages of this trade dispute, Canada had a partial shield. Goods that met the terms of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the trade pact that replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, were largely exempt from the tariffs being applied elsewhere. If a product satisfied the rules of that agreement, it crossed the border on the old terms. That carve-out did a great deal of quiet work. It kept much of the integrated manufacturing relationship functioning even while headlines suggested everything had changed. The new 50% measure, as it has been described, does not respect that boundary in the same way. That is the shift. For the first time in this sequence, a major tariff is being applied to Canadian goods regardless of whether they satisfy the terms of the Continental Trade Agreement that the current American president negotiated during his first term. Justin Wolfers, a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan, described this as a genuinely new phase in the dispute, rather than another turn of the same wheel. That characterization is his analysis, not an official finding, but it points to something concrete. Here is why that distinction is not merely legalistic. Rules of origin under the Continental Agreement determine how much of a product must be made within North America and under what conditions for it to qualify for preferential treatment. Automakers, parts suppliers, food processors, and metal fabricators have spent years organizing their supply chains around those rules. Compliance is expensive and deliberate. Companies invested in documentation, sourcing, and audits precisely because compliance guaranteed access. If compliance no longer guarantees protection from a new tariff, then the value of all that planning is called into question. That is a business confidence problem as much as a border problem. To understand how the two countries arrived at this point, we need to go back to the beginning of the current American administration. Among the earliest measures applied to Canada were tariffs justified on the basis of fentanyl trafficking. Those measures included no exemption for goods that complied with the Continental Agreement. Canadian officials pushed back on the underlying premise, noting the limited volume of fentanyl associated with the northern border. The dispute over that framing has never been fully resolved, and it set the tone for everything that followed. A trade relationship being reshaped through instruments that were not primarily about trade. What happened next is important because it explains why Canadian negotiators believed they had found workable ground. The American administration adjusted its approach and reinstated an exemption for goods meeting the Continental Agreement's terms. That exemption was not extended in the same form to other trading partners. Countries in Europe, in Asia, and in the Pacific did not receive an equivalent carve-out. For a period, Canada occupied a relatively protected position inside a global tariff structure, and Canadian officials treated that as evidence that the agreement itself still carried weight in Washington. The pattern then repeated in a different form. A further round of tariffs applied a 10% rate to countries around the world, including Canada, and once again goods that complied with the Continental Agreement were treated differently. So the agreement mattered in one instance, did not matter in another, and mattered again in a third. That inconsistency is the heart of the current difficulty. Canadian negotiators are not simply trying to secure a favorable rate. They are trying to establish whether any agreed rule can be relied upon from one month to the next. That brings us to the central question facing the Canadian government. Prime Minister Mark Carney's negotiators are being asked to enter intensified talks with an administration whose previous commitments have been revised more than once. The economist I mentioned earlier has argued publicly that the practical problem is not the terms of any single deal, but the durability of it. He has compared the situation to the difference between a long-term partnership where both sides invest deeply because they expect the arrangement to last, and a transactional arrangement where neither side commits much because neither expects permanence. Trade agreements, in his framing, have historically been built on the first model.
Under the Trump administration's policies thus far?
Well, Canadian businesses are definitely feeling the squeeze, especially those that rely on the U.S. as a main.
His practical advice, offered as commentary rather than as any official recommendation, was that Canada should avoid any arrangement requiring large, costly commitments up front. The concern is straightforward. If Canada spends heavily to satisfy the terms of an agreement and the terms are later revisited, the money is gone and the protection is not. He also suggested that highly visible diplomatic events can satisfy a demand for public announcement without locking Canada into obligations it may not be able to enforce. Again, that is one economist's assessment. Canadian officials have not described their negotiating strategy in those terms. Now let me turn to the question that will dominate Canadian politics if August 19th arrives without a resolution.
And now down to just 22%. My goodness gracious, you just never see anything like this. As I said, it's like a bizarro Harry Houdini. You make an alliance, poof, disappear. All gone.
Should Canada retaliate? This is where the economic argument and the political argument pull in genuinely different directions, and I think it is worth setting both out fairly rather than pretending one obviously wins.
A chief data analyst, Harry Enton. So how do Canadians feel about the United States, eh? Oh, Canada. Oh, no. That's what...
The economic case against retaliation rests on an old and elegant idea. Wolfers credited it to the British economist Joan Robinson, who died decades ago and whose work is less widely known than it deserves to be. Her image was of rocks placed in a harbor. When a country puts rocks in its own harbor, ships cannot easily come and go, and trade becomes harder and more expensive. A tariff in this framing is a country placing rocks in its own harbor. So if the United States chooses to obstruct its own port, the argument runs, it makes little sense for Canada to obstruct its own in response.
Canada levying these tariffs and claiming that it's the U.S.'s 51st state. He may not even be in this position, and yet his position seems to differ from some others.
The first people harmed by Canadian tariffs would be Canadians, who would pay more for imported goods. The counter-argument is not economic. It is strategic. Wolfers described it himself, attributing it to colleagues who think more in terms of geopolitics than of price theory. Their position is that if a country absorbs repeated pressure without responding, it invites more of it. In that view, the cost of retaliation is understood and accepted as the price of deterrence. There is no way to reconcile these two arguments purely with data, because they are answering different questions. One asks what makes Canadians better off next month. The other asks what makes Canada harder to pressure next year. The Canadian government has not announced a final position on how it would respond if the measure takes effect. That remains unresolved, and I would caution against assuming any particular answer. What officials have signaled is a preference for continued negotiation ahead of the deadline. There is also a dimension of this story that receives less attention in Canada than it probably deserves, and that is the cost being carried inside the United States. Tariffs on steel and aluminum, applied at 50%, mean that American factories face substantially higher input costs for two of the most basic materials in industrial production.
No deal than a bad deal. And I think that's how many Canadians feel when it comes to what may be in store for the binational relationship when it comes to trade.
Wolfers made the point that this leaves American manufacturers in an unusual position globally, paying far more for metal than competitors elsewhere. Those costs do not stay inside factory walls. They move into construction, equipment, appliances, and vehicles, and eventually into what American consumers pay. There is a particular irony in that which I think is worth spelling out plainly. Building new factories in the United States, an explicitly stated goal of the current administration, requires materials. Cement, steel, and structural components are not optional. When the cost of those inputs rises because of tariffs, the cost of building domestic manufacturing capacity rises with it. This is not a claim that the policy cannot work. It is an observation that the same instrument being used to encourage domestic production also raises the price of creating it. Michigan is where these abstractions become concrete. The state sits directly on the border, and its economy is deeply integrated with Ontario. Parts cross the frontier repeatedly during production. Workers, suppliers, and small businesses on both sides operate as a single regional system rather than two national ones. Wolfers, who lives close to the crossing, describe the trade relationship as something that visibly shapes his part of the state. When tariffs are applied to that corridor, they are not applied to a distant trading partner. They are applied to a neighborhood economy. The bridge referenced in this discussion illustrates the point neatly.
With forced labor from entering their supply chains. And with no end to the trade dispute in sight, what does it all mean for Canadians? Joining us now to help us
A new international crossing between Michigan and Ontario has opened, which is straightforwardly good news for the movement of goods and people. But its opening was delayed, and that delay carried a cost for American companies as well as Canadian ones. The infrastructure that makes trade easier and the policy that makes trade harder are advancing at the same time, in the same corridor, involving the same businesses. That contradiction is one of the defining features of this moment. On the question of American public opinion, I want to be precise about what can and cannot be said. Wolfers stated that opinion polling shows the president has not persuaded the American public of the merits of his tariff policy, and he distinguished between winning the argument and proceeding regardless. I am not in a position to verify specific polling figures here, and none were provided. What I can report is that this is his reading of the available survey evidence. Whether that translates into any change in policy direction is a separate question, and so far there is no indication that it has. He also listed sectors where he believes American interests have already lost ground: wine sales, tourism, higher education, and potentially part of the automotive sector concentrated in the northern United States. Those are his assessments of where damage has occurred. They are worth taking seriously as informed analysis, while remembering that they are analysis rather than confirmed accounting. The broader point he was making is that this dispute does not have a clean division between a country imposing costs and a country absorbing them.
Has been to impose retaliatory tariffs. Just walk us through whether that strategy has worked, whether it has backfired, especially given
both economies are absorbing costs simultaneously. Now let me address the factor that may be doing the most damage of all, and it is one that never appears as a line item: uncertainty. Businesses can adapt to a tariff. They can reprice, resource, relocate, or absorb it. What they cannot easily do is plan when the rule may change again in 6 weeks. Investment decisions, hiring decisions, and capital commitments all require some assumption about the future. When that assumption cannot be made with any confidence, the rational response is to wait. Multiplied across thousands of firms, waiting is itself an economic contraction. Wolfers described the weight of that uncertainty on the North American economy as enormous, and he made an important point about how it compounds.
It looks like a hammer, right? And so it's almost impossible to stop those goods at the border. The United States has different tools where they just say, if the products come from Western...
Uncertainty on the first day of a dispute is manageable. Uncertainty that persists across many months becomes something different because the delayed decisions accumulate. Projects that were postponed once are postponed again. Suppliers that held off on expansion continue holding off. The cost is invisible in any single quarter and substantial over time. That uncertainty is not confined to trade policy. Energy markets are contributing their own volatility. During the ongoing conflict involving Iran, news that talks would continue arrived shortly before Asian markets opened and pushed oil prices lower.
The fact of the matter is that diversifying trade with the United States is a very tall order. You might as well just ask the government to be boiling the ocean, because
that kind of movement, driven by announcements rather than by changes in physical supply, is characteristic of markets that are reacting to signals in the absence of settled facts. Wolfers noted that the United States and Canada are both energy producers, which cushions the impact relative to some other countries, but consumers on both sides of the border are feeling the effect at the pump. So we have two sources of instability arriving at once: a trade dispute with a deadline, and an energy market responding to geopolitical developments. Neither is fully resolved. Both feed into the same set of household and business decisions. For a family deciding whether to make a large purchase or a firm deciding whether to sign a supply contract, the effects arrive combined rather than separately. There is another element here that I think shapes how Canadians should read this story, and it concerns time. Roughly 912 days remained in the current presidential term at the point this was discussed. Some voices have suggested that Canada's best strategy is simply to endure the pressure and negotiate seriously with whoever holds office after the next American presidential election. As a purely tactical proposition, that has a certain logic. As a practical matter for a business losing contracts today, it is a very long time to wait.
Or a shipload of solar panels or hammers or something of the sort. You don't know, looking at the good, whether that's made with forced labor or not. And so,
that tension between strategic patience and immediate commercial pain is unresolved, and it is real. Let me turn to who is most directly exposed if the August 19th measure proceeds as announced. Canadian exporters in sectors that relied on Continental Agreement compliance are the obvious first group, particularly manufacturers whose products cross the border more than once during assembly. Provincial economies concentrated in export manufacturing carry disproportionate risk. Workers in those plants face the possibility of reduced hours or slowed hiring if orders decline. Small suppliers with limited cash reserves are more vulnerable than large firms with the capacity to absorb a shock. On the American side, the exposure runs through purchasers rather than exporters. Firms that buy Canadian inputs face higher costs, and those costs are typically passed along the chain. Border communities that depend on cross-frontier traffic for retail, hospitality, and services see effects quickly. Consumers encounter the change last and least visibly, in prices that rise without an obvious explanation attached. This is one of the reasons tariff debates are politically complicated. The costs are widely distributed and hard to trace, while the stated benefits are specific and easy to name. Now, what remains genuinely unresolved? Several things, and I want to be clear about each. It has not been confirmed whether the 50% measure will take effect on August 19th as announced, or whether it will be delayed, modified, or withdrawn during negotiations. The precise scope of goods covered has not been fully detailed in the material available. Whether Canada will respond with countermeasures has not been decided publicly, and it is not yet clear whether the Continental Agreement's exemption structure will be restored in any subsequent adjustment, as has happened before in this dispute. Those uncertainties matter because the pattern so far has included reversals in both directions. Measures have been announced and then narrowed. Exemptions have been granted and then bypassed. Anyone telling you with confidence what the tariff landscape will look like in September is making a prediction rather than reporting a fact. What I can tell you is what conditions would need to change for each outcome. If negotiations produce an arrangement acceptable to the American administration before August 19th, the measure may be suspended or altered. If they do not, the announced rate is scheduled to apply. One question I expect many viewers are asking is whether the Continental Agreement still provides any protection at all. The honest answer is that it currently provides partial and inconsistent protection. Much of the tariff structure applied to Canada continues to exempt compliant goods, and Wolfers was explicit that Canadian exporters had been doing comparatively well under that arrangement until this latest announcement. The new measure represents an exception to that pattern rather than its abolition. Whether it becomes the new rule or remains an exception is precisely what the coming weeks will determine. A second question worth addressing directly: does a negotiated agreement solve the problem? Based on the recent record, an agreement changes the immediate terms, but does not necessarily settle them. That is the concern underlying much of the analysis I have described. It is why some argue Canada should avoid front-loading costly commitments into any deal, and it is why Canadian officials have been careful about how much they claim to have secured at any given stage. Wolfers also raised a broader point about how the stakes are perceived on each side of the border. He suggested that Canadians can be reasonably confident about the continuity of their own democratic processes, while some Americans are focused on domestic institutional questions alongside economic ones. That was his framing of the wider context, and I present it as his view rather than as an established assessment. It does illustrate something relevant, though. The two countries are experiencing this dispute inside quite different domestic conversations. Stepping back, here is how I would summarize where matters stand. The United States has announced a 50% tariff on billions of dollars in Canadian goods, scheduled for August 19th. And the significant change is that it is not structured to spare goods that comply with the Continental Trade Agreement.
More options than some of us in the US because, I think Carney, the middle powers approach, things like that. You guys can be pretty sure you're going to have elections.
President Trump defended his economic approach during his Michigan appearance in a state that both benefits from Canadian trade and stands to absorb real costs from restricting it. Talks between the two governments are continuing. Nothing about the outcome is settled. What I would watch in the coming weeks is fairly specific. Watch whether the administration publishes detailed guidance narrowing the list of covered goods, because that has been the pattern in earlier rounds. Watch whether the exemption for compliant goods is reinstated in any modified form. Watch for any signal from Ottawa about countermeasures, and note whether officials frame their approach in economic or strategic terms, because that choice will reveal a great deal. And watch the manufacturing corridor between Michigan and Ontario, because that is where the effects will show up first and most clearly. The deeper issue running underneath all of this is not any single tariff rate. It is whether the rules governing the largest trading relationship in the world can be treated as stable. For decades, businesses on both sides built factories, hired workers, and signed long-term contracts on the assumption that they could. That assumption is now being tested in public, with a date attached to it. Whatever happens on August 19th, the question of reliability will outlast the specific measure, and it is the question that will shape investment decisions in both countries for years. Thank you for watching my report on the 50% tariff announced on Canadian goods and what it could mean when the August 19th date arrives. This story is still moving, and the next official announcement from Washington or Ottawa could change the picture considerably. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you receive the verified updates as negotiations continue, the details are clarified, and we learn whether this measure takes effect as announced.
Okay, William, thanks so much for your time and insight today.
My pleasure.
That is William Pellerin, an international trade lawyer with Macmillan LLP.
Announced.